Most people think belly fat is a motivation problem. They assume it exists because of laziness, poor discipline, or bad food choices. But when you look closely at human physiology, that assumption collapses. Belly fat is not stubborn because you lack willpower. It is stubborn because your body has been given the wrong signals for years, sometimes decades, and it has adapted perfectly to those signals. From a biological standpoint, abdominal fat, especially visceral fat, is not passive storage. It is metabolically active tissue. It communicates constantly with your liver, pancreas, immune system, and brain. And when it accumulates, it is usually doing exactly what it was programmed to do: protect the body in an environment that appears hormonally to be unsafe. That is why traditional advice, eat less, move more, often fails specifically at the waistline. It ignores the signaling environment that determines whether fat is released or locked away. To understand why intermittent fasting works where calorie counting often doesn't, we have to stop thinking in terms of food quantity and start thinking in terms of metabolic state. The human body operates in two primary energy states, a fed state and a fasted state. These are not philosophical ideas, they are measurable hormonal conditions. When you eat, insulin rises. Insulin's job is not just to manage blood sugar, it is to signal abundance. And when insulin is elevated, fat storage is prioritized and fat release is suppressed. This is where many people unknowingly sabotage themselves. In modern eating patterns, food is consumed frequently: breakfast, snacks, lunch, snacks again, dinner, and often something late at night. Even when calories are controlled, insulin is repeatedly stimulated throughout the day. The body remains in a continuous fed state, never receiving a strong enough signal to switch modes. As long as insulin remains elevated, fat cells are effectively locked. You can exercise intensely, restrict calories aggressively, and still struggle to access stored fat, especially visceral fat. Intermittent fasting does not work by magic. It works by creating time. Time without food is what allows insulin to fall low enough for a metabolic transition to occur. This transition is often called the metabolic switch. It is the point at which the body shifts from relying primarily on glucose to relying more heavily on fat-derived fuel. But this switch does not flip immediately when you stop eating. For roughly the first 8 to 12 hours after your last meal, your body is still operating on stored glucose, mainly glycogen in the liver. During this phase, hunger can increase, energy may dip, and people often assume something is going wrong. In reality, this discomfort is not a sign of damage. It is a sign of adaptation. The hormone ghrelin, often labeled the hunger hormone, rises in predictable waves during this period. Importantly, ghrelin secretion is strongly conditioned by habit, not by true energy deficiency. If you normally eat at certain times, ghrelin will rise at those times even if your body has ample stored energy. This is why hunger during fasting often comes in waves and then fades. It is signaling expectation, not emergency. As liver glycogen becomes depleted, insulin levels continue to fall. Once insulin drops sufficiently, the body begins increasing counter-regulatory hormones such as glucagon and noradrenaline. These hormones do not signal shutdown, they signal mobilization. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. When food is unavailable, the body does not conserve energy by becoming lethargic. It becomes more alert, more focused, and more capable of seeking food. This is why many people report improved mental clarity during fasting rather than cognitive decline. At the cellular level, this is the moment fat metabolism begins to dominate. An enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase becomes active when insulin is low. This enzyme allows stored triglycerides to be broken down into fatty acids and released into circulation to be used as fuel. Visceral fat is particularly responsive to this process because it has a higher density of hormone receptors and is more metabolically active than subcutaneous fat. When the hormonal environment finally permits fat release, visceral fat is often mobilized first. This is not cosmetic fat loss. This is a systemic metabolic shift. And it explains why people often see reductions in waist circumference before dramatic changes on the scale. Importantly, short-term fasting does not slow metabolism. Multiple studies show that resting metabolic rate is maintained or even slightly increased during early fasting phases, largely due to increased catecholamine activity. The body is not entering starvation mode. It is entering a fuel-flexible state. Understanding this distinction is critical because much of the fear surrounding fasting comes from confusing prolonged malnutrition with controlled fasting windows. In the next section, we will examine what happens beyond the initial metabolic switch, how fat-derived fuels begin supporting the brain, how muscle tissue is protected, and why the timing of fasting matters more than many people realize. Once the metabolic switch has occurred, the body enters a phase that is often misunderstood and frequently misrepresented. This is the phase where fat-derived fuel becomes dominant not only for muscles but for the brain. At this point, the liver begins converting fatty acids into molecules called ketones. Ketones are not a backup fuel. They are a highly efficient energy source, especially for neural tissue. In fact, the human brain evolved to function exceptionally well on ketones during periods when dietary carbohydrate was scarce. This matters because one of the most common fears surrounding fasting is the idea that the brain will be deprived of energy. The opposite is often true. Glucose-dependent brain function is metabolically expensive and unstable. Blood sugar fluctuates, insulin rises and falls, and energy availability can feel inconsistent. Ketones, by contrast, provide a steady and predictable fuel source. They cross the blood-brain barrier efficiently and are associated with reduced oxidative stress and improved mitochondrial efficiency. This is why many people report increased mental clarity, improved focus, and a calmer cognitive state once fasting progresses beyond the initial transition phase. But this shift does not occur instantly. It emerges after insulin has remained low long enough for fat mobilization to become sustained rather than intermittent. This is one reason why the timing of fasting matters more than many people realize. A fasting window that consistently reaches into the 16-hour range tends to be long enough for ketone production to meaningfully increase in most individuals. Shorter windows may still be beneficial, but they often do not allow this deeper metabolic state to stabilize. Importantly, this is not about pushing the body to extremes. It is about allowing physiology to complete a process that modern eating patterns repeatedly interrupt. As ketone availability increases, another concern often surfaces: muscle loss. The assumption is intuitive. If the body is not receiving dietary protein, it must break down muscle tissue to meet its needs. However, this assumption does not align with how human metabolism actually responds to short-term fasting. When insulin levels fall, the body increases secretion of growth hormone. Growth hormone plays a critical role in preserving lean tissue. It reduces protein breakdown, supports fat utilization, and signals the body to spare muscle during periods of low food availability. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense. Muscle tissue is metabolically valuable. It enables movement, strength, and survival. Losing muscle during a short period of food scarcity would reduce the ability to acquire food and increase vulnerability. As a result, the body preferentially increases fat utilization, while protecting muscle mass provided the fasting period is not prolonged into malnutrition. This distinction is crucial. Controlled intermittent fasting is not the same as chronic underfeeding. Chronic calorie restriction with insufficient recovery can lead to metabolic adaptation and lean mass loss. Intermittent fasting, when paired with adequate nutrition during eating windows, operates through a different hormonal pattern. Another process becomes increasingly active during this phase: cellular maintenance. When digestion is paused, the body reallocates resources. Instead of processing incoming nutrients, cells engage in repair and recycling processes. One of the most well-studied of these processes is autophagy. Autophagy is a regulated system by which cells identify damaged components, such as misfolded proteins or dysfunctional organelles, and break them down for reuse. This is not destruction, it is renewal. Research indicates that autophagic activity increases during periods of nutrient deprivation, particularly when insulin remains low. This contributes to improved cellular efficiency and may play a role in long-term metabolic health. While autophagy is not exclusive to fasting, fasting provides a reliable physiological context in which it can occur more consistently. At this stage, it is also important to address a persistent myth. Starvation mode. The idea that the body immediately slows metabolism in response to short-term fasting is not supported by evidence. In the early phases of fasting, resting energy expenditure is often maintained or modestly increased. This is driven by elevated levels of catecholamines, which enhance alertness and energy availability. Metabolic slowdown is more commonly associated with prolonged calorie restriction without sufficient recovery, not with time-restricted eating patterns that include regular refeeding. This difference explains why many people experience better energy, not worse, when intermittent fasting is implemented correctly. However, none of these benefits are guaranteed simply by skipping meals. The structure of the fasting pattern matters, and so does how the fast is broken. If a fasting window ends with a rapid insulin spike, such as from refined carbohydrates or sugary foods, the metabolic advantages gained during fasting can be quickly reversed. Fat mobilization slows, ketone production declines, and the body re-enters a fed state abruptly. This does not mean carbohydrates are inherently harmful. It means timing and context are critical. Breaking a fast with foods that minimize excessive insulin response allows the transition back to the fed state to occur gradually, preserving metabolic flexibility rather than disrupting it. Ultimately, the goal of intermittent fasting is not deprivation, it is adaptability. A metabolically flexible body can switch efficiently between fuel sources. It can tolerate periods without food, without panic, and it can process food effectively when it is available. In the next section, we will examine how to apply these principles in a practical, sustainable way, how to structure fasting windows, how to avoid common mistakes, and how to integrate intermittent fasting into real life without stress or rigidity. Understanding the biology of fasting is important, but understanding how to apply it in real life is what determines whether it helps or harms. Most failures with intermittent fasting do not come from physiology. They come from structure or the lack of it. One of the most common mistakes people make is assuming that all fasting windows are equal. They are not. The difference between a 12-hour fast and a 16-hour fast is not incremental. It is often qualitative. A 12-hour fast is a transition phase. For many people, it allows insulin to come down slightly, but not consistently enough to stabilize fat-derived fuel use. It can be a useful starting point, especially for metabolic beginners, but it often does not produce noticeable changes in body composition or mental clarity. A 14-hour fast begins to shift the balance. Liver glycogen is more consistently depleted, insulin remains low for longer periods, and fat mobilization becomes more reliable. Many people feel better at this stage, but the system is still fragile. A 16-hour fast is where physiology becomes predictable. For a large percentage of individuals, this window is long enough to allow the metabolic switch to complete and remain active for several hours. Ketone production increases, hunger waves diminish, and energy becomes more stable. This does not mean 16 hours is mandatory. It means it is often sufficient. What matters most is not the number itself, but whether the fasting window is long enough to allow insulin to stay low without interruption. This is why small behaviors during the fast matter more than people realize. Sweetened beverages, flavored creamers, sugar-free snacks, and even small amounts of carbohydrate-containing supplements can raise insulin enough to partially shut down fat mobilization. The body does not interpret these as almost nothing. It interprets them as food. During the fasting window, simplicity is an advantage. Water, black coffee, and unsweetened tea are generally compatible with maintaining a low insulin state. Anything that adds sweetness or calories introduces variability that can undermine consistency. However, fasting does not end when you eat. How you break the fast is just as important as how you maintain it. After a prolonged low insulin period, the body is temporarily more insulin sensitive. This can be beneficial or disruptive depending on the composition of the first meal. Breaking a fast with highly refined carbohydrates or sugary foods produces a rapid insulin spike. This abruptly shifts the body back into a storage-oriented state and can cause energy crashes, hunger rebound, and digestive discomfort. In contrast, breaking a fast with protein, fiber, and fats allows insulin to rise more gradually. This supports muscle preservation, satiety, and a smoother transition back to the fed state. This does not require perfection. It requires awareness. Another common mistake is treating intermittent fasting as a constant stressor rather than a rhythmic pattern. Fasting works best when it is paired with adequate nutrition during eating windows. Chronic undereating, excessive training, or insufficient recovery can push the system toward fatigue rather than adaptation. The goal is not to eat less forever. The goal is to alternate between periods of low insulin and periods of nourishment. This rhythm, fasting and feeding, is what restores metabolic flexibility. It is also why fasting should not be rigidly identical every single day for everyone. Some individuals thrive on consistent daily windows. Others benefit from variation: shorter fasts on training days, longer fasts on rest days. Context matters. Physical activity during fasting deserves special mention. Light to moderate movement, such as walking, often enhances fat mobilization without significantly increasing stress hormones. High-intensity training, however, may require strategic timing to ensure recovery and performance are not compromised. Again, this is not about rules. It is about feedback. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of intermittent fasting is psychological. Hunger is not simply a physical sensation, it is also a learned response. When eating patterns change, the brain initially resists. This resistance often fades as new rhythms become familiar. This is why consistency, not force, is the most reliable strategy. Intermittent fasting is not meant to feel like punishment. When implemented correctly, it often reduces food preoccupation rather than increasing it. Over time, many people notice they no longer panic when a meal is delayed. Energy becomes more stable, cravings lose intensity, eating becomes more intentional rather than reactive. These changes are subtle, but they accumulate. Ultimately, intermittent fasting is a tool. It is not a moral framework, a competition, or a test of discipline. Used thoughtfully, it aligns modern eating behavior more closely with human physiology. Used carelessly, it can become another source of stress. The difference lies in understanding, not restriction. In the final section, we will bring everything together: how to evaluate progress beyond the scale, how to know whether fasting is working for your body, and when it may not be appropriate. By now, the mechanics of intermittent fasting should be clearer, not as a trend, but as a physiological framework. Yet one of the most important questions remains unanswered for many people. How do you know if it is actually working? The scale alone is a poor indicator. Body weight fluctuates due to hydration, glycogen levels, and digestive contents. Short-term changes can obscure meaningful progress or exaggerate setbacks. More reliable signals tend to be functional. A reduction in waist circumference is often one of the earliest indicators of improved metabolic signaling, particularly related to visceral fat. Changes in how clothing fits can precede noticeable shifts on the scale by weeks. Energy stability is another key marker. When intermittent fasting is working, energy tends to become more consistent throughout the day, rather than peaking after meals and crashing afterward. Mental clarity often follows. This does not mean constant alertness or stimulation, but a quieter, more stable cognitive state with fewer fluctuations in focus. Hunger patterns also change. Instead of persistent cravings, hunger becomes episodic and predictable. Many people notice that hunger waves weaken over time rather than intensify. These are signs that the body is becoming metabolically flexible, capable of switching between fuel sources without stress. However, it is equally important to recognize when intermittent fasting may not be appropriate. Individuals with a history of eating disorders, uncontrolled metabolic disease, or certain hormonal conditions should approach fasting cautiously and with professional guidance. Fasting is a tool, not a universal prescription. Symptoms such as persistent fatigue, dizziness, disrupted sleep, or declining performance are signals, not failures. They indicate that the current structure may need adjustment. This could mean shortening fasting windows, increasing nutrient density during eating periods, or modifying physical activity demands. Intermittent fasting is not about endurance. It is about alignment. When the fasting pattern aligns with an individual's physiology, lifestyle, and recovery capacity, it tends to feel sustainable rather than draining. Another common misconception is that fasting must be practiced indefinitely to maintain benefits. In reality, metabolic flexibility once restored often persists, even when fasting frequency is reduced. Some individuals cycle fasting periods seasonally or use them strategically rather than continuously. This flexibility reflects resilience, not regression. It is also worth addressing the cultural pressure to optimize relentlessly. Health is not a constant upward trajectory. It is dynamic. Periods of structure and periods of relaxation both serve biological function. Intermittent fasting should support life, not dominate it. At its core, fasting is not about avoiding food. It is about restoring contrast. In modern environments, food availability is constant. This erases the natural metabolic rhythm between feeding and fasting that human physiology evolved to expect. By reintroducing intentional pauses, fasting restores this rhythm. Insulin rises and falls. Fuel sources alternate. Cells repair. Systems recalibrate. None of this requires extremes. None of it requires suffering. The most effective approach is often the least dramatic one, the one that can be maintained calmly, consistently, and without fear. If there is one principle to carry forward, it is this: the body responds to signals more than intentions. Intermittent fasting works when it sends clear, consistent signals, periods of low insulin followed by periods of nourishment. When those signals are respected, the body adapts accordingly. When they are disrupted by constant snacking, stress, or rigid rules, progress slows. Understanding this allows fasting to become a supportive framework rather than a source of anxiety. And that is ultimately the goal, not control, but cooperation with physiology. If this explanation helped clarify how intermittent fasting actually works beyond headlines and hype, consider supporting the channel. Your engagement helps make evidence-based health education more accessible. More importantly, take this information as an invitation to observe your own body with curiosity rather than judgment. Biology is not a moral system. It is a feedback system. Learn its language, and it becomes far easier to work with rather than against it.